A very warm welcome to everyone, both in the room here in Brussels and joining us online for this discussion on how we can chart a stable path towards climate neutrality in the EU, and what tools we have at our disposal and how we can best use them, improve them to make sure that that direction towards climate neutrality is being pursued in a stable and resilient fashion in the turbulent times that we live in. I think this is particularly fitting considering that today is a day that media is reporting on new long-term, at least almost 20-year deals on additional investments and delivery contracts on fossil fuels into the EU, certainly to Germany. But also, as right now, a few 100 meters from where this conference is taking place in the real world, the European Commission is putting forward its outlines of additions to the framework on carbon dioxide removal, another important piece of the climate neutrality puzzle. And so it is my pleasure to welcome you all. My name is Matthias Duwe. I'm head of the climate team at Ecologic Institute, a Berlin-based European think tank on environmental policy. And I want to make sure that you all know that this event is brought to you jointly by two projects. The first I want to mention is called Climate Recon 2050, and that is a platform that we've been coordinating for almost 5 years now, that has been bringing together experts and decision makers from member states around the EU to talk about the development and implementation of long-term climate strategies. And we've been able to do that with financial support of the European Climate Initiative, or EUKI in German, by the German Environment Ministry, originally now the German Ministry for the Economy and Climate Action. And we have also received support from the European Climate Foundation. And to both of these funders, we are immensely grateful. The current iteration of the platform has been co-organized by partners from Poland, from Estonia, from Slovenia and Romania. Some of them are joining online, others are here in the room. It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for all your work and the collaboration with you. And this is the one part. The other part is the Ariadne project, which is a real sizable research effort, a consortium that brings together 25 partners that are all bringing in their relative expertise to the mission of the project to arrive at analysis that can support policymaking in Germany to enhance the path towards the clean energy transition. This effort is supported financially by the German Research Ministry, and it is led in coordination by the colleagues at Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research, PIC. And Ecologic Institute has been fortunate enough to have been involved in both of these, and they're bringing the people and the discussions together today. I have the pleasure of guiding you through most parts of the next, well, not quite anymore 2 hours, but I'm not doing that alone, not by myself. With me to help with the moderating is Erika Hope, who's a director for climate planning and laws at the European Climate Foundation, a philanthropic organization that is supporting a variety of actors to advance the climate action in Europe, both at EU and national level. And Erika has been dedicating the past years of her work at the ECF to enhancing climate governance institutions, procedures in various ways at both EU and national level. And I'm very grateful that you agreed to share this job with me today, Erika. So good to have you. I'm saying this also with a brief nod to Berlin, where my co-conspirator on Climate Recon 2050, Eva Ivashuk, was unable to come to Brussels and join us here today. It is a bit of a tragedy, Eva, but I know you're listening and will join the discussion if and where you can. With that, I want to say that in terms of the agenda, Erica is in fact going to start things off when it comes to content. And that's the session on long-term climate strategies that we're going to start with, of one of the two tools to get us to a more resilient climate governance system in the EU. And the second one of these tools is going to be scientific advisory councils and their potential contribution and role in this context. For both of these segments, we are privileged to have two experts that have agreed to join us and spend their time here so that we have an opening panel situation, and then we're going to open it up to the audience. And, you know, for those that are actually here in this room, we have the opportunity afterwards to engage in further more informal conversations with a brief networking reception. And this is, you know, it was important to us after a long period of, you know, largely engaging via Zoom and other platforms, that we're trying at least to meet some people in the real world, but create a hybrid setup so that we can also have our colleagues and experts that can only join for those 2 hours, don't want to or can make the journey, are saving the emissions and the energy it takes to do so, but that we can combine them in this type of setup. To put those two audiences, online and on-site, on a bit of equal footing, we've decided to engage you using the platform Slido. Or, you know, we'll see whether that works in the way intended, but I'm keeping my fingers crossed. Most of you will know this. It requires you either, you know, taking your smartphones, as already some colleagues here in the audience are doing, to scan the code, or type in at slido.com the number, the 7 digits that you see on the screen here, and probably also in the chat, and use this to put forward your questions. We would also welcome comments, but I warn you, the space, that there's a hard character limit. You know, it's Twitter style. You can't get in a lot of detail if you're trying to do comments, but both would be okay. Of course, it would be nice if we can actually go to some of the people that are here in the room directly with the microphone later. And so if those that are in the room are using Slido for that purpose, you know, just add #room or the like, so that we can know that something's coming from here and that you can ask in person. This, of course, is also an event that is being recorded. Everything will be shared online later, and well, we'll see how well this setup works. So much for the logistics and the structure of it. And with that, I'm going to bow out for the moment and hand over to Erica, who is going to give you a bit of additional framing on content. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Matthias, and really nice to see everybody here today. This is the first actual event that I think I've been to in 2 years, so quite excited. Had to think about shoes. So we're going to start with a metaphor to kind of help describe our overall context today. And for this purpose, we've taken an image from a recently published analysis by Ecologic of the national long-term strategies, which was something ECF commissioned because we wanted to have a comparison of what's going on in those documents. And as part of this report, this nice metaphor was produced. Metaphors are never perfect. They all have their issues, but we're going to give this a try. So with the adoption of the Paris Agreement, reaching climate neutrality or net zero emissions was adopted as the global objective. And the EU has adopted this as its goal for 2050. And of course, all of this is to allow the world to avoid the most dangerous effects of climate change and help keep within the 1.5 degrees limit. And most member states have also adopted this 2050 objective for themselves. Some have adopted it to trying to get there earlier. And the journey doesn't necessarily end there, because in most cases, or it is said even in the EU climate law that we need to get to net negative emissions thereafter. But in terms of orientation, and for the purposes of today, climate neutrality is the goal that we're talking about, and the summit that we need to reach. You can see there is here a mountain. But the challenge is that we don't yet live in a net zero economy. We know that to get there will require significant changes in the way we produce and consume energy and many resources. And not all of it's going to be an uphill climb. Some bits of it are going to be fun. Some bits will be quite tough, but we really have to get moving. We can't just stay where we are if we need to reach this summit. The current status quo is not an option anymore. We know many of the means through which we can achieve this and through which we can arrive at the summit, but the implications of these are complex, and in some cases the specifics are not always clear. To use the metaphor, we won't know which river we're going to meet necessarily in detail, or what state it's going to be in, or how many scary fields of cows there's going to be on the way until we're actually kind of on the way. We're not sure about the exact path that we're going to take and which turns we're going to take where. And also, there is more than one possible climate neutral future. The path that we take matters, and by making choices, certain choices, we shut off some of the other choices. And by making those choices, we also decide on the path, but we also decide on what the view is going to look like from the top of the mountain. So as you see this mountain metaphor, it's more about the journey than the final goal. It signals where we want to go, but we're not sure about the path. And there are other elements that we can use, like the fact that we might get distracted on the way up by other important matters. We might take wrong turns, end up in dead ends, and we risk also never getting to the top or getting there too late. And so, as if you're setting out on a mountain expedition, we need all of the information and support that we can get. And our discussion today is really about the tools that we can use to help us find the way to the top. So, interim targets are one of those tools that can act as milestones to help us on the road to the top. You can see this mountain with its possible routes up. Net zero indicators that check specifically for progress on important elements of the transition can tell us where we might be off track and where course correction is needed. And these indicators can relate to the actual underlying structural changes in different sectors of the economy that might be needed, rather than necessarily just the kind of aggregate amount of emissions that we're releasing, like a satellite-based GIS system. And among the many tools, there are two that we're focusing on today, as you know. And in the context of this metaphor, we could say that the long-term strategies are the map. They can help us to uncover possible paths up the hill, and to show us where there's decisions needed, whether we go left or right. And they might also help us to identify what the different options are for reaching the top and help us to decide the route to take. And the scientific advisory bodies, what are they in the context of this metaphor? They're the mountain guide, who can provide regular input to decisions on the path and the implications of those, the policies to realise those, and to check for progress and also to suggest necessary corrections. And so with that, I think we'll leave the metaphor there for now. But we're going to really, I think, open the first session and go more deeply into the long-term strategies. So I may just invite Vicky up to this podium. So thanks, welcome. And just very briefly, long-term strategies, as I'm sure you all know, are one of the documents that member states are asked to provide to the Commission under the governance regulation, the other one being the National Energy and Climate Plans. And of course, they have their origins in the actual Paris Agreement, where countries are invited to produce these documents. In the governance regulation, they're supposed to have at least a 30-year time horizon and to be updated at least every 10 years. And crucially, from our perspective, the NECPs are supposed to be consistent with these long-term documents. And all member states were supposed to submit their long-term strategies by the 1st of January 2020. As of this morning, I think there are three missing still, but most they're coming in. Most of them are there, and France has been a pioneer in this, which is helpful since we have France represented here today. So to introduce the panelists, we have here on the stage Vicky Pollard. Vicky is the acting head of unit for the head of unit. Congratulations. Perfect. Excellent choice. Sorry. So in good news for us all, Vicky is head of the unit A2 in the Commission. So that's the unit on foresight, economic analysis and modelling at DG Klima. And Vicky has been working on EU energy policy and climate for over 20 years, I think. Yeah, covering many things: renewable energy legislation, emissions trading, China relations, among many others. And her unit is responsible for national long-term strategies, but as the name suggests, her work really is generally to be in charge of organising much of the modelling that underpins long-term policy proposals on climate action. So really delighted to have Vicky here today. Thank you. We're all a bit shy, aren't we, after Zoom? And then we also have on the screen here Gwenelle Podesta, who is the Deputy Head of the Emissions Projections and Modelling Department at the Ministry of the Ecological Transition in France. And Gwenelle has been closely involved in the development and updating of the French National Long-Term Strategy. And he's also been a regular attendee at climate recon workshops and super helpful with sharing details of the underlying process in France with colleagues from around Europe. So lovely to have you here as well, Gwenelle. Welcome.
Thanks, Erica, and good to have everyone in the room.
Thanks. And so I think we'll begin the conversation today with a look at the member state perspective. So turning first to Gwenelle. France has invested a lot. It's one of, I think, the good students, we can all agree, in terms of its national long-term strategy over the past years. And this is something that was very clear during many of the inputs to the climate recon process, which brought together, as Matthias mentioned at the beginning, people working on this from around Europe. And the recent analysis, Matthias, or I think I mentioned it at the beginning, of the national long-term strategies that was recently published by Ecologic, we also see from that that France has put a lot into it. So Gwenelle, obviously there was a certain sort of priority put on this within France. Please, could you just tell us briefly about the role that the strategy plays in your national context and the extent to which it's helped you to put your national policy on track towards climate neutrality? And I'm looking at Gwenelle here, but he's there as far as you're concerned.
Thanks, Erica. Yes, indeed, we did start quite a long time ago with the long-term strategy, since our first strategy was published in 2015 for COP21. And after that, we did the first revision between 2018 and 2020 of our strategy, which is currently ongoing. And we are now on the process of revising the strategy to the third edition of it, which should be published around 2024. So it has been quite a journey, and taking the metaphor of the mountain, we did take some wrong turns sometimes and experience some bad weather. But I think, yeah, it was helpful to have this experience, because we could really much see a shift from a strategy which was initially a lot of a technical exercise and let's say like an administrative burden, towards something which was really more helpful for policymaking, but also for non-state actors, for firms and other think tanks. And I think this was mostly due to the fact that we try to involve a variety of stakeholders as much as possible. And this really much helped them to get ownership over the strategy, and to really much help them in seeing what the transformations to their own businesses should be in the future. And also the fact that we are having a very detailed scenario based on modeling, which we provide figures about on our strategy. And I think this sort of quantitative aspects really much help them to get very detailed strategies of their own, and really too much to serve as a reference for a variety of either non-climate policy or firm strategies. So right now we also have the High Council for Climate Change. So we may talk about this later, but I think it was very much a new institution that helped us to put the climate policies and also the carbon budgets at the center of the political debate. And it was very striking to see that in the last law that we had in 2021 about climate change, all the members of parliament were asking, okay, but how does this specific provision compares with the long-term strategy, and how much more should we do? Are we on track if we propose this very specific measure? And in the end, for example, we had a proposal for a levy on mineral fertilizers on agriculture. And it was decided that the levy would only enter into force if the carbon budget for agriculture is not respected. So yeah, again, another example of how the quantitative aspect of our strategy also helps to improve our policymaking in other sides of our actions.
Great, thank you, Gwenelle. That's really interesting to hear that it has become and was used as a real sort of central reference by a lot of actors in France. And obviously, one of the things that we might hope might come from having these sort of well-researched, thorough documents is. Can you hear? Okay, is there a weird whistle going on? It's okay. Is that when you have strong political headwinds, that having this map might help you to stay on track. Closer to the mic, okay. Might help you to stay on track. And obviously we're in a period, or the last few years, we've had a lot of strong political forces playing, like the COVID pandemic, obviously, and now what's happening with Ukraine and the economic fallout from that. Is there any sense in which this strategy has been helpful in sort of making choices around some of the challenges that have arisen from those political events?
Yes, indeed. Now that our long-term strategies is really much settled in the political landscape, it was again used. I gave the example of the climate law, but again for the post-COVID recovery plan. We did have a lot of emphasis on trying to set the measures on the recovery plan that are aligned with our long-term strategy, and out of it, there came various set of measures. For example, expanding the train networks, or subsidizing the use of bikes, improving the retrofit of buildings, in particular public buildings. So there were all these sort of set of actions that were decided during the COVID recovery plan that was directly derived from our long-term strategy. So again, another useful example on how a long-term vision can also help closer-term policymaking. And again, very recently, with the impacts of war in Ukraine, we did release a sobriety plan, energy sobriety plan, that was also designed to help us through the coming years to face the energy crisis. And it was also designed in a way that it can also set the proper base for the future in terms of energy consumption, because we feel that there was an opportunity to use this crisis to sort of start making the shifts that are needed for the upcoming years. And in particular, in France, we are a bit late on our energy efficiency targets at the EU level. So there was both let's say, reasons to even do more on this part of energy efficiency and sobriety. Yeah. Mm.
Thanks, Gwenelle. And I think one of the a topic that we've exchanged on briefly before is that in principle, one of the key values of having these long-term strategies is that they can help to sort of uncover the interactions and trade-offs and implications between sectors. So, for example, something that needs to happen in one sector can only happen in another, if something else has happened in another sector. And any suggestions as to what I should do to stop this whistle? Keep going? Yeah. Okay, I feel bad for everyone, but so yes, if one sector can only do what it needs to do if another sector is doing certain actions. And I just wondered when actually doing the analysis and really digging in as deep as you did do in your detailed scenario, whether you revealed things that surprised you, and perhaps where you've given a couple of examples already, but things where by doing the strategy you modified your policy in certain areas.
Yes, indeed, we really much experience the value of having this modeling exercise and prospective scenarios that are common for both our medium-term policies, including the NECP, and also the longer term vision or the long-term strategies. So this is the same modeling exercise for us. And the fact that it has this sort of economy-wide focus, and we are also doing some cross-sector analysis. It helped us to take some lessons learned, let's say. And for example, I already gave the example of the availability of biomass. So we have a lot of sectors that want to rely on biomass to get decarbonized, especially in the longer term. But when we make the math, we see that we don't have enough biomass feedstock to all the uses that are expected from the various sectors, and this obliges us to make a hierarchy between the uses of biomass, and to change also our shorter term policies so that we don't end up locked in a certain uses. And for example, in the building sector, there are other alternatives to biomass. For example, we can install heat pumps, or heating urban district heatings. Whereas there are other sectors where there are very much fewer alternatives to biomass. For example, international aviation. So this was a lesson learned for us, and then we also started to make the adjustments to the existing schemes that are already in place. For example, we did subsidize households to get biomass-based heating systems, and now we're sort of trying to shift them toward more electrified or heat pumps systems. And another example on this is the synergy between the transport system and in the industry. So, for example, in our strategy we very much plan to have much more transportation by train, especially for goods. But we noticed that most of the goods that are transported today by train are goods that are going to decline in the strategy. For example, coal or steel. All these materials in the strategy are bound to decline in terms of amounts. And then it raises the question of okay, so what do we do with our industry, especially if we are in a perspective of reindustrialization? Where do we put the new industries? Do we put them near train stations or near ports? It raises a lot of questions in terms of planning and infrastructure planning in particular.
Thanks, Gwenelle. Really, really interesting examples there, I think, showing how the importance of doing this kind of economy-wide look rather than just sort of each sector planning by themselves. And also mentioning there the spatial implications of a lot of this, because there's a lot of land going to be needed for a lot of the things that people are counting on for their strategies, I think. So thank you very much for that. I will have probably some more questions for you shortly. But I'd like to turn to Vicky, if I may. So hearing there, I think some almost a sort of best case example of how a long-term strategy can be helpful if it's gone about in the right way and done thoroughly. Sort of, slightly controversially, I might say the European Commission has had a slightly ambivalent relationship with the national long-term strategies, if I may. Obviously, its own EU long-term strategy was a really sort of excellent and I think pivotal document that set out and proved the point that the EU could and should be aspiring to climate neutrality, and that was what helped to adopt that goal into law. And that has inspired a lot of member states as well with their own goals. But as to the actual national long-term strategies, there has been quite a lot more attention on the national energy and climate plans, which of course are very important as the documents that kind of set out in more detail the very near-term policies. But as I think somebody's mentioned on the chat here, or whatever we call this today, Slido, how can we plan policies for the future if we don't know what the way to the top of the mountain should look like, which I take as a sort of an endorsement really of the importance of long-term strategies. So it would be interesting to hear your perspective on what is the role of national long-term strategies in the overall context of EU climate policy, and how potentially could they be strengthened?
Yeah. So thank you, Erica, and because you have two British women here, if we go too fast, slow us down, because we will tend to speed up.
Yes, indeed. Sorry.
No, but I do the same. So you can shout at me or wave if you don't understand. Oh, good. Okay, so of course, long-term strategies are really important in terms of setting the vision and the pathway. So as you say, the path to the top is very important. I think I very much agree with what Gwenelle has set out in terms of the role in terms of communication and bringing people together behind the project. So the consultation aspect, the engagement aspect, I think is really important. Of course, it's also about creating a reference for the many different public and private decisions, including new legislation at member state level, and of course for investments. And so it's particularly important, I think, where you have long-term investments for infrastructure. I think some of these aspects are also picked up in the NECPs, but we can come on to that maybe in a little bit. And I agree also that the national long-term strategies have been really important in terms of pushing for more in-depth analysis at national level, more quantification, more use of modelling. I think the fact of having that quantification, as in the French case, is really important in terms of giving a better perspective of what is possible and what's not possible, and in terms of measuring progress, but also anchoring decisions in a way. Mm-hmm. But I think it's also been very important in terms of the process of using that quantification, using that modelling information in a national debate. And I think what you see is also there's a very different level of capacity in different member states. Some member states, such as France, I guess Germany, have a lot of capacity and are further ahead. For other member states, it's a much bigger challenge, and it's not such a natural thing to have the use of that information. And I think for me that's a really important element. From the EU policy perspective, well, I think first of all, maybe coming back to the national perspective, I think stakeholders need certainty. And I think when you look at the national long-term strategies, they're very varied in terms of whether they have targets or they present scenarios, but without targets. Most talk about a commitment to climate neutrality, but in terms of the actual quantification, it's okay. They're very varied. And I think what we see is that some of the more successful long-term strategies are those where there is a clear target. And so I think in terms of creating certainty, I think we do have the EU level long-term strategy, which has been very important in terms of setting the 2050 climate neutrality target. And for me, the fact that we have that does help a lot in terms of where there are gaps or weaknesses in the national long-term strategies. I mean, there is a clear EU level pathway, a clear EU level target set in law, in the climate law, which requires all member states to move towards that target. And so in a way that's filled, that means that some of the areas where we don't have the lack of, you're losing people very fast in terms of moderators. The fact that not all national long-term strategies have the legally binding targets and those clear is maybe less of a problem that would have been in the absence of the climate law and what has come with the EU long-term strategy. But having said that, I think it is really useful to have the long-term strategies when, for example, we look at I mean, we use it in all sorts of areas where we're looking at investment in member states. So, for example, I mean, if we look at the territorial just transition plans in the context of the Just Transition Fund, member states or the regions to basically access the money have to put forward these territorial just transition plans, which are approved by the Commission. In the legislation, we refer to the NECPs, but I think it's also been very useful where there are national long-term strategies to look at what the transition is to 2050 or to the national climate neutrality target date, because it allows us to get a better sense in the discussion with the region and the member state as well to whether the plan does present a transition, and to access the Just Transition Fund, you need to show that what you're doing is compatible with the transition to climate neutrality. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Vicky. I think it's a good sort of point to make to show that there are indeed now several processes that require information on the long-term transition. It's not just, if you want, although they're largely national energy climate plans, the national reform programs needed to have a link. You pointed to the territorial transition plans as well. How can, though, if some of the assessment shows that indeed not everybody is has the level of detail required in their long-term strategies that, say, France has, and has already gone through now the second iteration of updating, what can be done also at the EU level to support and strengthen these strategies and make them better in those countries where they're basically lacking the detail that you would actually need for them to be able to inform all these other processes?
I think, well, the first thing is that we demanding the strategies. So people may know
only
that
3 to go.
Yeah, 3 to go. And so what happened is that the date for submission was 2020. The Commission did the analysis looking at whether the national long-term strategies collectively take us to the how far they take us towards the EU targets. At that stage, we had 20 long-term strategies. We now have 24, but there have been 2 have come in since the infringement process has taken place. So it's true that is important in terms of making sure that everybody does have a long-term strategy and using the legal powers that the Commission has to show that we do want them to be produced. That's important for a start. So they basic level. I think we have about 14 of the long-term strategies which have the sort of elements of quantification we need. So I think also we do a lot of work both in the context of the member states' requirements to report on projections, in the context of the NECPs and the long-term strategies, in terms of, am I too close to the microphone? Sorry, I'm not too far.
You're being kind in looking at me.
Sorry.
It's the whole not looking at your screen thing. It's irritating. I have the same.
Sorry, I'm losing my train of thought.
My apologies. You were saying 14 have enough quantitative information.
Yeah. But I think the focus on first of all on helping people. We help with recommendations on parameters to use. We provide data. We provide capacity building. We fund projects which help people in terms of their capacity. Very important, for example, at the end of October, Bulgaria submitted the national long-term strategy. They've received support, technical assistance support. There is technical support instruments under DG reform where there is a lot of investment in basically providing access to modelling to consultants who can help countries put together the quantification. I think it's also a question of providing the structures and insisting, when we do the analysis, pointing to the areas which are very important to allow people to push for the public consultation, for the engagement, to ensure that they are effective. Because I think it is about, as I said, we have at EU level, we have the 2050 target. We have a body of legislation which ensures that there is a certain progression made. I mean, there are member state targets under the effort sharing regulation. There's the legislation on LULUCF. There's a whole range of legislation, but what really matters in terms of the implementation is that collective understanding of what that means at a national level and the agreement to go with it. And I think it's that element is very important in terms of getting the best out of the national long-term strategies.
Thank you very much. I think that's a good pointer, and that we've seen also in our conversations with country colleagues, you know, how the support for the analytical capacity can really, you know, support the process and boost the standing. But you know, Gwen, I'll maybe ask for your sense here. So, you know, in France, it seems, you know, you're basically at the highest political level. There is strong support for this as a tool, but you know, that wasn't that. You know, do you have any pointers in this regard? How, you know, also if you're looking at what you know about the situation in other member states, and if you're looking at what's coming from the EU level, how could the political importance or attention to long-term strategies over, for example, the NECPs be strengthened from your perspective?
Yes, Matthias, indeed, the fact that we have also a very strong political leadership on the issue of climate change obviously helps us to advance on the question, but also the fact that we have had this sort of revision cycle every 5 years on our long-term strategy also helped us to every time doing things better. For example, our modeling has evolved quite a lot, and it got more complex, and we can dwell into more detailed issues every time. And I think this has also been helpful. And I think in the current legislation, the EU member states are obliged to update their strategy only every 10 years, to my knowledge. And I think, yeah, maybe having this sort of more frequent cycle also helps to like improve the elaboration process of the strategy itself. And another point that also helped us to put the long-term strategies at the center of the political debate is to have carbon budgets that are sort of the main tool that we have to connect the long-term goals to the shorter-term action that required to be done. And so we have these 5-year carbon budgets until 2032, and also a sort of annual trajectory for GHG emissions. And every year we have the High Council for Climate Change that produces a report that is presented to the parliament, and to which the government has to answer within 6 months. And so this sort of politicization of the greenhouse gas trajectory helped to put the issue of climate change at the center of the debates for each and every political debate that we have had. For example, even in the finance law this year, there has been a lot of discussions around the investments that are required for climate change this year. And maybe one last point that I would like to insist maybe on is that I mentioned that we have one common sort of modeling for the 2030 targets and the 2050 ones, so NECPs and long-term strategy. But maybe to insist on the fact that we also look at different things. For example, in the 2030 targets, we try to be very detailed on the policies that are required, the actions, the investments that are needed in each and every sector, and how to scope the support schemes also for those who are more affected by the transition, all these kind of things. Whereas the 2050 vision is more here to sort of describe the transition, the transformation that needs to take place, and to sort of give a sense to people to where direction we're going, but without necessarily being very detailed on the exact measures that will be needed to get there. So I think this is sort of a dual approach with the same tool that helps to the political requirements for each targets.
Thank you very much. So I think what you're describing here is in a way a similar division of labor that is intended also in the governance regulation between the shorter term national energy climate plans and longer term strategies. But you have then in France a number of enablers that make this a success that we don't have in other countries, and that are not basically, in a way, the stimulus for which is missing, I think, currently from the legislative framework. You have the integration of the analytical basis for both of them. You have frequent updating cycles, which we also don't have for the long-term strategies in the EU legislation, and you have the political attention through integration in your context. And so if I'm looking at, I think, the way that the two are otherwise treated in other countries, they're really, the kind of the step sibling, basically at best, I think, the long-term strategy. So my question then to you, Vicky, where do you see that in addition to capacity and maybe awareness raising support, the changes are possible at the EU level that really enable that integration of the long term and the short term much more?
So we've already started, I mean, with the climate law, the projections of greenhouse gases need to be produced now by member states for the reporting up to 2050. And so there is draft guidance on the NECPs, which has been issued along with the State of the Energy report package. And that, for example, encourages the NECPs to look also to 2050 in terms of projections. And so there is a sort of, as the NECPs get closer to the timeline of the national long-term strategies, so closer to 2050, then there is, of course, in terms of the analysis, things coming together. I think it's also important because I think part of the issue is just time. There's a lack of capacity in some member states. So it's sometimes not just about having access to modelers and people with that the quantitative background. It's actually just people, to run the processes. And so what we also do is try and simplify things as much as possible. So in the way things are reported, in the way member states have to present things to try and reduce the administrative burden. I think it's
So might you also consider making any adjustments in the revision of the governance regulation that you are, is part of your long list of to-dos, I think, for, stuff to get done before the end of this current commission?
So there is a review of the governance regulation coming up. It's not immediate. Next year is a very
year and a half.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So next year is very important in terms of the reporting, and actually it's also a very important year in terms of some of the other processes, in terms of the information that's going to come in and seeing where we need, adding more information into terms of where we need to improve. But yes, I can't tell you what's going to be exactly in the review of the governance regulation, but it creates lots of opportunities to do things better. I think the standardization of, I think it's one of your recommendations is about standardization or the obligation to do things in a standardized way. I think member states might see that as a bit of an extra administrative burden, but I think actually that's can be helpful if we do it in a sensible way, because it also helps people understand the types of information, and it helps the stakeholders understand, and it helps stakeholders who may be working across borders also get more involved in some of the national debates. And I think, it's very clear in the NECP context for the energy side, when people are looking at some of the energy investments, it's something which is very much promoted because of the need to work across borders. I think some aspects which go beyond the sort of pure capacity building and bringing people together to exchange things could be helpful.
Thank you very much, and realize that this is basically the start of potential inputs that you're taking into consideration. But we hope to continue that part of the conversation. Getting on to other aspects, also I'm here monitoring on the side what we have in terms of questions coming in. One that there are two that I definitely still want to bring up before we end this segment. The first one is the integration of these sectoral perspectives. In the conversation with Erica, you were basically saying, and Gwenelle gave these examples of the importance of considering sector-specific concerns, for example, for the siting of investments, for the timing as well. And we have this question here from the online audience, from Florie Gansolin from the Chemicals Industry Association, CEFIC, who's asking, what is your view on sectoral roadmaps and how you integrate the needs of of the sectors into kind of the larger planning. And I'm paraphrasing in part. The specific quote is, "What is your view on sectoral roadmaps?" And I'm adding the integration part. And actually that'd be interesting to hear from you, Vicky. But Gwenaël, if you on that specific of question of industry sector specific detailed roadmaps towards the long term, if you have some insights to share on France, that would also be good. Vicky, maybe you want to start.
I think from our perspective, it's an element of the climate law. I think it's important. In my team, we're working now looking at the 2040 target. And of course, we're looking at everything that's being produced, and therefore the sectoral roadmaps are an important element in that, along with other sources. So I think it is helpful in terms of, well, both in the sector in terms of driving the ambition within the sector, but also in terms of just the information that feeds into our processes.
But these in the law, I think they don't have, there's no process for integration, there's no assessment or specifics on dialogue. I don't know, is there something you can say in this regard in terms of specific right now, or is that?
I mean, it is a voluntary process.
Right.
Having said that, I think there are a number being produced. I think they are useful. I think they are, I mean, we can't regulate everything, right? And I think that for those of us who are looking at developing, doing new analysis and new strategies, we're looking to, to get the latest information, and that's the level of detail, the richness that comes from those sector roadmaps, and the sense of, the level of understanding of what's happening across the sector, I think is important, because it's also a reflection of discussion sector wide. I think it's very useful for us to have information such as that, but I'm not sure that it necessarily needs to be beyond a voluntary approach.
Thank you. I'll come back to that, but first I'd like to hear from Gwenaël, your perspective or any relevant experience from France.
Yes, indeed. After we revised the long-term strategy, we started doing some sectoral roadmaps, asking basically especially for industry, for each industry branch we asked them to produce roadmaps to implement what was written in the strategy, and to basically detail the levers that they were intending to use, and also provide data about costs, because this is something we were a bit short about on the second strategy. Everything that relates to investments and costs, and it was pretty helpful because they produced all these roadmaps, and now we, as the Fit for 55 package happens and everything, we are asking them to revise it to get up to the level of ambition that we are aiming. But I think that this sort of perspective of having the ambition being given top down, and then having this sort of bottom up approach on how to implement this target was pretty helpful. And it's helped to put together, both state actors and industry actors to have these more detailed roadmaps to which they can get even more ownership than the strategy itself. And now you may have heard about it, but since the elections, we had the creation of the General Secretary for Ecological Planning. That was a new institution placed under the authority of the Prime Minister, which is in charge of the ecological planning. So not only climate change, but also adaptation and biodiversity. But so yeah, we're having a lot of various streams of work within this context, and most of them are related to having this sort of sector roadmaps to get more details on the implementation at the level of a sector.
Thank you very much. I have to make a hard choice now, looking at the various points being raised here, what we still address in kind of the final minutes of this specific segment. I think I'm going to go for something that I think may connect us a little bit also with the next segment, and that is about the relationship between the EU level and national level policy. So in the introduction, Erika mentioned the important role that the EU long-term strategy has played in putting climate neutrality on the map. We now are seeing the conclusions, fingers crossed, of the Fit for 55 negotiations. All of that is shaping what climate action looks like at the national level, and so the law doesn't have on either climate law or governance regulation any updating requirements for the EU long-term strategy. Of course, at the same time, Vicky, your unit is organizing the analytical work towards the 2040 target proposal. So, maybe first, I'm actually going to go again to you, Gwenaëlle, and say, what were your expectations? What do you see how important is the EU level framework and having a long-term strategy perspective also across the EU as a whole for you from a member state perspective? And then we can ask Vicky about what she makes of that and how much she can promise in that regard. Gwenaëlle.
Yeah, I'm not sure whether we are the best example of it, because we had a long-term strategy aiming at climate neutrality even before the EU adapted its own target. So we didn't expect things from the EU level when we produced it at the time. But one thing for sure is that it's helpful that maybe the long-term strategy, because there are various ways of getting to climate neutrality. And I think in the EU long-term strategies, there was several scenarios getting to net zero. There was one which was called LIFE, if I can remember correctly, and the other one called, I forgot the name. But yeah, there was these sort of various tracks which had very different implications for the investments, but also for the attainment of other sustainable development goals. That I think it's helpful to sort of document a little bit more, and maybe even if it's, I don't know if it's possible at the EU level, but provide orientations toward what type of trajectory you want to get, especially in terms of behavioral changes or things like this, because it's very something that changes a lot the quantified sort of output that we can provide in the modeling, and then again for the everything that comes from the Fit for 55 package obviously has enormous implications on the work that we do, since it constrains very much the sort of the levers that are that we can use or we have to use on those that we cannot.
Thank you very much. I think also the reference to the specifics, they're very useful. I think this connects me back to the mountain that we saw earlier, the different ways up. The Clean Planet for All was essentially describing two different views from the summit. There are two different climate neutral futures or paths to get there. One, the more technical carbon storage version, and one that was more circular economy, etc. So in that sense, I think the vision potential of it is strong, but also at the EU level, providing guidance and a perspective that can look at potential across the EU and is not confined to individual country territories really lends added value. So are we going to get something close to an update of the EU long-term strategies from your work, Vicky?
Well, the 2040 target is obviously halfway between 2030 and 2050. So it's the pathways which will be described will be we're getting closer to reality and building on the developments which have happened since, because of course there has been a lot of development. We have the Fit for 55. We have a lot more information on new technologies. There's in particular in terms of LULUCF, with the big developments in policy on LULUCF, we're in a different place, but we'll also have a lot more work to do, of course, on LULUCF and what that means post 2030 for the land use sectors generally. I think I'd be interesting to see that some of the areas where the national long-term strategies tend to be weakest or lacking information on in terms of sectoral coverage, also areas which are just tricky in terms of harder to abate areas. But yes, I mean, we're looking, well, one, that we will have an indicative, a report on an indicative greenhouse gas budget for the first time. And I know that's that is our connection. Yes, exactly. To the advisory board is asked under the climate law to provide us advice on that. But in terms of the climate target plan, we're looking at how to get a better representation of some of the more developments in the harder to abate sectors. So, for example, around the circular economy, around land use, yes, around all the we're looking at issues around behavior, but again, they're challenging areas to look at, and that's why at the moment we're still at the stage where we're working to collect as much information. We're working with the modelers. It's still early days,
Sure,
but I'm hoping that it's inspiring for everybody. And yes, at this stage we will be entering a public consultation sometime in the new year. I can't say exactly when, but that's going to be important, and getting feedback from people is very important in that context.
brilliant. Thank you very much indeed, Vicky. Thank you to both of you for providing your insights, sharing the experience on long-term strategy development, both at the national level and at the EU level. Round of applause as we dare in the real world. Thank you so much. And with that, we are, and Erica, you're doing okay? Good, very good. So we will do a very brief switch over in terms of segments, and you will then you'll have to still stick with me as the moderator now for our next session, which will be on looking at the metaphor and on the mountain guides, the type of organizations that can support on an ongoing basis the development of climate policy making. Climate policy needs up-to-date information, factually correct basis, to counteract, or at least have serve as a source of basis of information for policymakers. Politics always come in the way and then do with them what they will, but that is essential. And that is why, in fact, a third of EU member states have already put in place at the national level independent scientific advisory bodies. More are on the way. Portugal and Spain have adopted framework climate laws that already established such advisory bodies, and they differ in many ways, in size, in composition to some extent, in the mandate in terms of what they are asked to do, and also in terms of the resources that they have available. But they also have a number of things in common. That's at least on the basis of analysis that we were able to carry out in the past 2 years. The ones that currently exist, they often serve a role of a watchdog, if you will, evaluating policy progress, assessing policies and their effectiveness, but also they act as policy advisors. Of course, that's in the name, if you will, providing input on options for governmental climate action, but also an understanding of the potential applications. And then they also start acting more and more as a convener in bringing together stakeholders, inviting them, including them in a dialogue level. And at the EU level, this was already alluded to, of course, and for everybody here knows who you can see on screen and next to me with Oddmar Edenhofer and Mary Donnelly, our expert speakers. At the EU level, modeled on the experience in the example of these national advisory bodies, we now have a European Scientific Advisory Board on climate change that was included and established through the European Climate Law. And it was established earlier this year. It's been the inspiration for us including this session in the event. And I'm very glad that we have representatives here from both levels now to speak to us on the role of such scientific advisory bodies. They need very little introduction, but let me try to do the honors as best I can. I will start with our expert hailing from Ireland right now on screen, Mary Donnelly. Thank you so much for being here with us. Mary was, of course, well known to an EU climate and energy policy audience for her many years of work in Brussels at the European Commission, in her last post, ultimately working as Director for Renewable Energy, Energy Efficiency and Innovation at DG Energy, and she is currently the chair of the Climate Change Advisory Council in Ireland. Thank you so much, Mary. It's good to have you.
Thanks very much indeed, Matthews.
And with us in the room here, Ottmar Edenhofer, similarly well known to the community with many different roles that he manages to combine. He is currently, of course, the Director and Chief Economist of the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research. That is also our coordinator for the Ariadne project, and Ottmar in that role is its spokesperson. He's director of the Mercator Institute for Global Commons and Climate Change in Berlin. He teaches, he works with the IPCC. For full transparency, he's also a member actually of the Climate Change Advisory Council in Ireland, correct?
No longer within the IPCC.
No longer within the IPCC. Thanks for it. Yeah, AR5 was a tough one, I'm sure.
Yeah.
But he's also one of the chairs of one of the national advisory bodies in Germany. So he has a bit of the combination of he has that national experience, but he is now here today with the new hat of having been elected as the chair of the European Scientific Advisory Board on Climate Change. Ottmar, thank you so much for making the time.
Thank you very much for being here.
In terms of talking about the role of the advisory boards bodies, Mary, I would like to start with you to go to the national level first, as we did in the earlier session. The Irish Climate Council, has a number of tasks in the legislation. It needs to work on a number of issues. Tell us a little bit about how you communicate your results and your insights to policymakers, and to what extent do they need to take them into account? How binding is your input, if you will?
Okay, so if I can take just a few moments to explain the construct that we now operate in Ireland. As oftentimes happens with a new government and a new government programme, it was agreed that we would take the ambition from the Paris Agreement and introduce it into legislation in Ireland. So we adopted legislation in 2021 that targeted 51% reduction of emissions by 2030 and climate neutrality by 2050. And in order to achieve that, we built a construct around this. Firstly, we have our targets of 2030, 2050, those are subdivided then into 5 yearly carbon budgets. And the budget then is further subdivided into each of the sectors, into what we call sectoral ceilings. And the role of the council was to recommend to government what should be the 5-year carbon budget for the first 2 periods, 2021 to 2025 and 26 to 2030. And we will continue that on an ongoing basis then beyond 2030. And in doing so, the council's recommendation, which was based on independent analysis, scientific analysis, separate from, shall we say, government, was adopted ultimately by our parliament and enshrined in legislation. So that was a very important role that the council had in terms of identifying what the carbon budget is and the fact that it actually becomes legislation. Then the question is, okay, what do we do to ensure that we are staying within the carbon budget? Well, we have firstly an annual cycle that we follow where the government brings forward what we call the Climate Action Plan. And that sets out what are the actions, what are the policies, what's the funding, and indeed what is the impact of these measures by sector for the year, short-term actions, because we're really looking for immediate impact on all of these. And as part of the council's process, we review what the government is doing, what the policies are they working, are they not working? We have a formal mechanism which is called the annual review, and we come maybe mid-year with that. And on the basis of our review, our parliament then interrogates each minister, because each minister is responsible for their own sector. So the Minister for Transport is responsible for the emissions in the transport space, Minister for Agriculture responsible for the emissions in the agricultural space. And they then have to go before Parliament each year on the basis of their performance as assessed by the Council as part of the annual review. And that's a structured process that we have in place. But as you know, it can't just stop there. It can't just be once a year, big bang, lots of noise. There are many, many issues that the council looks at, analyses, does a scientific analysis on, and that we communicate both directly to government, and we have, we write to the Prime Minister, for example. We also communicate with the media because it's very important the public are aware of what we're doing. And then we also have perhaps a less visible but equally important mechanism, which is what we call sectoral dialogues, where we have structured meetings with each of the government departments to go through their policies in advance of their adoption, and also to monitor to the extent to which they're taking place. So this ongoing dialogue directly with government departments is an important element in terms of those departments being aware that we are watching what's happening, and indeed, insofar as we can, we will support them, but we will equally make comments if the policy is not delivering. So the role of the council, as I say, is not in government. We are outside government. We are independent. We are scientifically based. But our view is, of course, are we on track? Are we taking the right measures? Are we on time? Which, of course, is the key issue right now. And these are the measures that we use in order to get a binding recommendation in place in Ireland.
Thank you very much, Mary. So you actually have been given, if you will, quite strong powers by your legal framework to impact a policy. That we can juxtapose that a little bit with the situation at the EU Climate Advisory Board in a second. First of all, you were mentioning also your independence, at the same time having this integrated role. I know that you have this unique composition in Ireland where you have both public officials and members with an excellent academic reputation combined. Can you tell us a little bit about the background for this and how it may shape or influence your work?
Well, yes, indeed. So we have a council membership of 14. We have scientists. We have Otmar, for example, is one of our scientists. We have Peter Thorne and Cara Augustenberg, Morgan Bazilian, and others who are, shall we say, climate scientists, climate experts in the space. But we also have economists. We have a representative, for example, who was a trade unionist. We have financial experts, biodiversity, transport, and industry. But the key issue, and this is the one you're identifying, is that we have 3 what's called ad personam nominations to the council. One comes from our Environmental Protection Agency, and that is the agency that actually does the analysis, does the inventory, and does the projections of emissions for Ireland. And it's very important that the council has a very close connection with EPA in terms of the analysis they're doing, the results that they come out with, and how they assess the performance in a technical sense. We also have an ad personam director from Teagasc. Teagasc is our agricultural research facility in Ireland. And that's particularly important because, in Ireland, more than 1/3 of our emissions come from the agricultural sector. We are very different to most countries in Europe in that respect. So it's very important that on the one hand, they are in the council so they understand what the council is going for, but also that the council can understand what the realities are on the ground in terms of the agricultural sector. And the third, which is an innovation on this occasion, is our meteorological office. And that actually is proving to be extremely interesting because their projections and their analysis going forward with their satellite data, their satellite information coming through is hugely impactful, particularly in the area of adaptation, in terms of how we can advise government to respond to the impact and the consequences of climate change, and how the meteorological section is able to guide us in that sense and really strengthen our scientific basis in the area of adaptation. So yes, we have public officials, but of course they're there as individuals, but they do bring out a great deal of knowledge from their own organizations into our discussions.
Thank you very much for those clarifications. That's indeed a particularly interesting setup. I want to move over to the EU level. We're going to get to the tasks and priorities in a second. But Otmar, the first question, maybe a little bit more challenging. There is a lot of scientific expertise out there that's already advising and supporting policymaking in the EU. Vicky and her unit get consultants in as well. They have input from the EEA, the JRC, etc. What is it that you think the EU Climate Advisory Board brings? Why do we need it to support our climate policy making?
Yeah, first of all, it's not up to me to decide why I need it, because obviously we are in the climate law, and this is the formal justification. But indeed, we do not duplicate, and we don't want to duplicate things. And I think it is important to understand that we are a scientific reference point, independent, but we have to take into account a very specific, let's say, decision-making framework. We should basically provide the scientific knowledge for the EU to reach the climate neutrality goals. And this should be underpinned, the pathways, by scientific expertise and by the most up-to-date information. Of course, you could ask the question, why should Vicky not look at the IPCC reports? And the answer is very simple, because the IPCC reports are not focusing on the specifics of climate neutrality within Europe. So we are basically advising the Commission, and we basically evaluate the carbon budget, but also the instruments. And we are completely independent. Whenever we feel there's a specific and an important issue in this process, be it from the mitigation angle or from the adaptation angle, we are absolutely free to do this. We have not such a, we are not within the part of, let's say, the executive power within the Commission. We are outside. We are purely scientific. There are only scientists in the group. But we have to take into account this decision-making framework within the EU and the setting, so to say, climate neutrality and how to achieve climate neutrality. This should be underpinned by scientific information. In that sense, we are not replicating and duplicating what others are doing. We are now the reference point. We report, so the Parliament will pick up our insights and, so to say, facilitate, in particular, European debate. So this is how I would roughly describe our mandate. It's a little bit, it's not so strongly related to the government like in Ireland, but nevertheless, so just to an example, what we are doing is now we have sent guidelines how to calculate the European carbon budget. We come up with some quantitative information, and then we evaluate what the Commission has proposed. So this is what we are doing.
Thank you so much, and maybe you can expand on indeed the things that the advisory board has picked out as priorities. I know you've already only been in business, if you will, for about a half a year, but started to already publish outputs. What are your priority tasks, considering that indeed the legislation doesn't give you a list of 5 or 10 things that are on the must-do list?
Yeah, there is not a must-do list, but so I have to be very careful, because we have now preparing the work program for the next year. Yeah. But it is clear that we will say something on the collective success within the EU. So we will talk about the consistency of the different measures at the EU and at the national level. We will definitely, at some stage, doing something. It's not very precisely on agriculture, on carbon dioxide removal technology. So this is roughly what we are doing. Not everything is decided yet, but along these lines, it's quite natural. It follows from the whole thing, thinking about carbon neutrality, and also we want to do something on adaptation. So we haven't finalized the full work program, but these are roughly, so to say, our focal points.
Thank you. And you, in a way, already alluded the way that you're thinking you're going to then see your outputs used, but maybe more specifically, what are your hopes or aspirations as to how you think you will be able to make a difference with the work of the advisory board?
I think the most interesting thing is that many scientific insights are available, of course, and so think about the IPCC scenarios. The IPCC scenarios are there, so there's no need to replicate the scenarios. But when it comes to the questions of how to calculate the carbon budget, how to do this, so there are two things involved. The one is these are the scientific facts, so to say, right? So what climate science is telling us, what is the global carbon budget, which is consistent with the 1.5 limit. But then there are many other issues which has to be taken into account. So what is the fair share? What does it mean in terms of feasibility? So we have to think about feasibility and all this criteria. So to provide transparent criteria to derive such a carbon budget, this is something where we want to provide guidelines. And of course, so then we will talk about also the quantitative ranges. And the interesting thing here is it's about facts, but it's also about values. And what we intend to do is we want to be explicit about the underlying values. So it's unavoidable. Whenever you take a decision, always values are involved. So you have specific goals and you have specific constraints, and this is unavoidable. But it is not up to us as scientists to say these are the only and the right values, because this is part of the public debate. But what we can do is we can basically allow and help the policymakers to use this information and also be aware what kind of value judgments are necessary to come up with in the end with the decision. And here we can facilitate a public discourse at the European level, with the Parliament, with the Commission, with the Council, and I hope that we will become really the reference point, where we are basically trusted scientists, but also respecting basically to deal in a professional way with the fact-value distinction. I think there's a distinction between facts and values, but at the same time, it would be a pure illusion if we would claim this kind of climate science, what we are doing is value-free. This would be an illusion.
Thank you. I think that will be well appreciated and enhance your overall reputation, that you're so transparent about the way that you will arrive at your recommendations. You just mentioned the engaging in public discourse, and I have one of the questions here that have come through our electronic platform from I think an academic colleague who's asking how the EU Advisory Board is going to go about collecting the inputs that it considers. Will there be consultations with scientists that are experts in certain areas, for example?
Yeah. So first of all, the foundation for science is the body of peer-reviewed literature. We rely on the peer-reviewed literature. So, and I hope they will not rely on peer-reviewed literature, but also on the assessment and also the synthesis of the peer-reviewed literature. I think this is very important, how to synthesize things. And this is something where this is not part of now my head of as a chair of the European Scientific Advisor. So we are doing this at MCC, carrying out a synthesis studies, because it's not good enough to say this is study A and study B, and study A says 3% and the other is 5%. So it's all about synthesizing knowledge, so to say. And relying on the synthesized knowledge and this meta studies is incredibly important, and we intend to do this. Of course, we want to carry out a consultation, but we want to be, when it comes to the scientific knowledge, we want to be as objective as possible. We want to inform the policymakers what is the status of the scientific literature. I know it's very hard. It is in particular very hard in the age of the explosion of peer-reviewed literature. So think about the IPCC, it's enormous what the amount of literature they have to assess. And I think in the future we have to use artificial intelligence to do this. Otherwise, I think we cannot digest all this literature. But along these lines, and also I hope that we can capitalize on the amount of ex post studies where we will be informed by the scientific community what kind of policy instrument worked, which did not work. And this is something where I hope that we can contribute in particular, because an institution like the IPCC has not the potential and even not the mandate to talk too much about successful policies. And I think we have the liberty to do this, and we should capitalize on this freedom.
Thank you very much. I will take some of these themes and move them over again to Mary. Also looking at some of the questions that have come in. And I actually, a similar question in terms of the analytical basis or the material inputs that are going into your analysis at the Climate Change Advisory Council, Mary. There's a question here: what the council is using as a reference to advise on the carbon budget, or whether you develop your own sectoral your own scenarios, for example. And in that context, kind of the most popular question here is that about the connection to our previous segment, the long-term strategy, because one of the three that are still missing is the one from Ireland. Maybe you can give us some background on that. So you essentially you don't have that strategy right now, at least, to use as a benchmark in the context of your work.
That's true. So firstly, in terms of the scientific basis of development of the carbon budget, this was actually developed during 2021 at a time when COVID was rampant. And we ended up having an inordinate number of meetings online through Zoom or Teams, as the case may be. I think we last count was 120 hours of meeting time, and that's before you even count the preparation. And in this context, we were very well supported by 3 models that have been developed by academia in Ireland that we could apply, take the international science, IPCC, and as quite rightly says, apply it within the context of the Irish situation, which would allow us to analyse what were the issues in Ireland on energy, looking at the various forms of energy and how we use it, and also agriculture, given that agriculture is such a big part of our emissions. And it's part of agriculture, as we now move forward to the AFLU concept, we also included forestry and land use as a modelling element in our analysis. So in that context, we were perhaps very fortunate with the quality and the availability of the analysis from our own academic institutions that was freely made available to us in a very participative way and in a very open way. And I think, I would really like to say for any of them that are listening, how much we appreciated their participation, their willingness to collaborate and to develop the budget with us. And that's something that we would hope to see going further forward. We now have a memorandum of understanding across all government departments where we have access to their research and their data on an ongoing basis. And I think that's a very important element of the science. But I'd like to kind of maybe move it a little bit into the other part of what we do, because it's what we find more and more is that the message of the numbers, the targets, and the need to do something is being received by the public at large. But there is a little bit of confusion as to what does it really mean in practice? What should I do? I want to do something, what should I do? I so frequently find myself in conversation with people who say, I'm very concerned about climate change and I recycle much more now than I used to do. And I'm thinking to myself, are we actually communicating a message to people as to what are the kinds of actions that need to be taken if we're really going to be able to have an impact in this space? And it's a little bit what Ottmar was saying there. in a way, we are frustrated because emissions in Ireland, we're almost on a treadmill. We have emissions and we're fighting a growing economy, a growing population, a growing electricity demand situation of 30 to 40% in the next 10 years. And at the same time, trying, you know, a housing crisis where we have to build more houses. And at the same time, we're trying to reduce emissions. So it's like, you know, the mouse on the treadmill trying to get this across. And part of our task really is to relate to the public in a way that they can understand. This means identifying successes, but also developing a vision. And if I may, just on the previous section, which I found extremely interesting, to Vicky and others, having been in Brussels and having had the privilege of being in the Commission, now I have to deliver on the ground in a member state. It's quite a different scenario. But, you know, when we talk about climate neutrality for 2050, what do we mean on a daily basis? I have asked people, you know, to close their eyes and imagine waking up on the 1st of January, 2050. Look around you. What do you see? Or better still, what do you not see vis-a-vis where we are today? And what would you like to see? And, you know, in a way, we should be having this conversation with people who are, say, 15 to 30, because it's their lives we're talking about. What do they want to see? Do they want to see, you know, autonomous cars? Do they want to own a car? Hopefully not a fossil fuel car, but do they want to actually own one? Do they want to be able to generate their own electricity from the building, from the solar panels, and manage all of that data through technology and smartness, shall we say? Do they want to have certain foods or not? So in other words, what do people really want out of society going forward? And I think this really goes to what Ottmar was saying about values. And the game that we're in at the moment is certainly 100% scientific. There's no discussion about that. But we cannot ignore the reality of people as part of this process, their values, their expectations, and ultimately their behaviors. So I think that's part of the challenge that we're facing here. And certainly when you talk about the long-term strategy, I know Ireland was supposed to submit it yesterday. Maybe it didn't, maybe it's still in the post. But the Commission will kill me for saying this, but, you know, having been there, done that, I'm less concerned about the paper exercise of filling in the long-term strategy. What I'm really concerned about is thinking through what it is we want to do, how we can deliver it, and what will deliver for people in a sustainable way in terms of a climate neutral society going forward.
Thank you very much, Mary, for opening up the conversation here a little bit. And I think Ottmar's, I'd be very interested to hear your reactions to the extent to you think that advisory bodies, where be the national or the EU level, should engage in such visioning processes and engage in a discourse with the public.
First of all, it is very important from my point of view to understand when it comes to the value and the debate about values. Of course, as a citizen, I can and I should be involved in debates about values. But I don't feel I have a specific competence as a scientist to judge values, right? So as a scientist, as a citizen, I can do this. I hope at least that I am a minimal competent moral participant in such a debate, but I cannot impose as a scientist and say these are the right and the wrong values. Number one. Number two, one of my experience and my great frustration as a former co-chair of IPCC was the following. It was very easy to talk even with hydrocarbon dependent countries about future scenarios. I don't want to name them, but they were happy to talk about carbon neutrality by 2050 because they thought, okay, this is not my business. But when it comes to questions like, what about the phase out of fossil fuel subsidies? So the same countries say, yeah, we want to become carbon neutral by 2050. made a very strong argument why the IPCC should be silent on phasing out fossil fuel subsidies, right? So what I'm saying here is, and here I can share a very interesting experience from Germany. So in Germany, you know, Germany is the country of the commission. So whenever we have a problem, we want to set up a commission. And therefore we have not just one climate committee, we have many, but at least we have two. And the other one, I'm only member of one, but the other one, they provide a very interesting report a few weeks ago. And what they did is they simply tried to figure out why Germany failed to reduce the emissions. And they made three claims, very interesting claims. Germany was relatively successful to build up the new carbon neutral capital stock, like renewables, like heat pumps. Germany failed to phase out the old capital stock, and we had a lot of problems taming the rebound effect. I think this is a very profound statement, because when we continue in Germany to focus on the old and the carbon intensive capital stock, and we have no specific policies to tame the rebound effect, we will not succeed. And this is a very sound way to deal with policies, because on the one hand, you have the targets, governments, are the government targets. And then you ask as a scientist, so what are the underlying, let's say, successes and also failure stories, why we didn't achieve these targets? And this is something where I think this kind of scientific advice reports could facilitate a social learning process without imposing values on people, because this are the government values. Of course, you can discuss to what extent these government values represent the values of the people, but this is at least a social learning process. And I think I would like to see scientists and the scientific community to be involved in that learning process, and looking back and asking the question why we fail or why we succeed. So this is a very healthy question. And I think this is in particular a question we as scientists can and should answer.
Thank you very much. You know, but in both cases, I think you know, would you agree that the role, and with both cases, I mean, kind of the ex post assessment, why we failed, and ex ante developing a vision for the future. Do you think there is a role, though, for such a scientific advisory bodies to engage with the public, if there is such a thing as an entity, or you know, do you feel that you need to, as you say, you know, basically as a human being, yes, but as a scientist, maybe I should stick to the rationality of the facts that I have and how I evaluate them. Is there a risk for this engagement with the broader public, or do you see that as part of the duties of what you also have as advisory bodies or as scientists?
I think it is completely legitimate to be involved, not just with policymakers, but also with the public. But we should be aware what kind of role do we have here. And there's one thing to say, I think these are the right values, and this is legitimate, but I cannot say science tells us this set of values are the right ones. I can say I want to be engaged in an ethical debate. This is completely true. But in an ethical debate, I have no specific competence as a scientist. I have a competence to be participating as a moral being, but not as a scientist saying this is my expertise. It's not my expertise to tell people what are the right values. And in that sense, when it comes to the engagement with the public, it's the same. We can inform the public, for example, why we failed. We can also say what could be implications for different pathways for a climate resilient, a carbon neutral society, for example, with a society which wants to lean more towards economic growth or lean towards more sufficiency. So this is possible to do. But then all these pathways, as scientists, we should be explicit about the underlying costs and the underlying values. And let me say one thing which seems to me is quite important. We spend, for my taste, I'm not saying this as a scientist, but we spend too much time to talk about the visions. We did not talk too much about the pathways towards that, and what are the pathways, what are the risks of these pathways? Are these pathways really resilient pathways, or these are very risky pathways? And I would say this is a debate which I think we should facilitate, and here scientists can play a role, but a very modest role, and we should be very modest in this debate.
Thank you. And if I think though, for example, Mary, when you were talking about asking about the visions, in a way, you were also saying, we want to ask and speak to issues that are important and that are of concern to the public at large. And we put the topic for this discussion, of course, in the context of us wanting to pursue climate neutrality, but there being other matters, crises, the war, the impact on energy prices at the heart of the political debate, at the core political attention, but also they are of very much of concern, and the impacts are to everyday citizens. So one thing that I would like to ask both of you, to the extent that you can speak to it as representatives of these advisory bodies, to what extent do you think you will or you are engaging with these issues, either the impacts of the crisis or just overall the social dimension of the transition? And maybe, would you like to go first, Ottmar?
Why not Mary? Because I spoke so long.
Excellent. Mary, you go first.
Well, on that specific one, in fact, earlier this year, almost immediately after the first elements of the crisis, and it became evident the implications on both the cost of energy and potentially even the availability, the security of supply of energy might become serious issues out of the Ukraine war, as indeed they have. The Council took that opportunity to write to our Prime Minister, to all of our leaders, in fact, political leaders, with a number of very clear messages. Of course, we understood the absolute imperative, both politically but also socially, of supporting people in society who were most vulnerable and who would be very seriously challenged, both by cost increases and ultimately, if we did have them, shortages of supply. So clearly that had to be done. But we urged the government to ensure that the measures that were taken were targeted measures, so that, in fact, we didn't end up in a situation of inadvertently undoing some of our objectives, for example, in the climate space. And one illustration of that was that we strongly recommended the reduction of the cost of public transport fares, and they were reduced by 20%. That was earlier in the year. We came back again in July and said we need to continue this, and that has actually been continued in our financial budget that came out in October. So it was to say to the government, target the measures that you're going to do in a way that doesn't undo the efforts that you're making in the area of climate. So, for example, we wouldn't really be in favor of reducing excess duty on petrol or diesel, because of course that's encouraging more transport. Of course, we also understand the political reality of the world that we live in, so there was some element done there. We do encourage, for example, a greater utilization of electricity as an energy vector, especially in the Irish context, where we have very abundant natural resources for both wind and solar, where electricity in time can be a major energy carrier, not just for power, but also for heat and ultimately for transport. So a shift, shall we say, in behavior to using electricity as a longer term energy vector is certainly something that we were encouraging, and that was acted on by the government, because the supports that were given, for example, in our budget, in our financial budgets, were in the area of electricity, albeit universal, but a shift to using what can be a decarbonised electricity system going forward. So in that context, the Council did take a very clear position on the implications for society of the crisis, energy costs going up, risks of supply, and of course underlying all of this is the message on energy efficiency. We had all of this back in the 1970s. We started a process of energy efficiency. We're back there again. We absolutely need to have an intensification of our activities in the area of energy efficiency, both for buildings and for consumption. And that was also an issue that we raised with the government. So we did take a very clear position at a very early stage on the likely implications of the crisis coming out of the Ukraine. And indeed, I'm sad to say that, circumstances and events have actually proven that these recommendations were actually very valid.
Okay.
Yeah, first of all, as the ESAPCC, we prepare and advise on policy responses in Europe to the current energy situation. But I cannot, so it's not published yet.
Okay.
And we agreed that whenever we speak on behalf of the board, we do this on the basis of a joint publication. So I'm not allowed to speak about this, and I will not do this. But what I can say is, just as an example, what we did in Germany with another head as a director of PIC. So in March, we started to evaluate the distributional consequences of the increase of the gas price. And based on this analysis, we recommended exactly what Mary said for Ireland. We said, so the compensation packages should fulfill two targets. First, it should provide an incentive to the households to reduce gas consumption, but at the same time, the vulnerable households should be protected from the increase of the gas price. I would say, by and large, the Gas Commission in Germany succeeded with this famous double whammy, which basically is now underway and hopefully will lead to a situation where we can protect households and create incentives. Of course, it's a problem because in Germany we have only access to the gas connection and not directly to the people. And we recommended, so we should have directly access to the households because it can be much more targeted. And just to access via the gas connection is a very insufficient way to solve that. And I think in the next winter we are challenged by that again, and therefore this direct channel would be helpful. But one thing I would like to highlight here is whenever we want to do such a thing like targeted transfers, targeted compensation, what we need is data and an epistemic infrastructure. And this is, from my point of view, very, very frustrating seeing. I'm sure that in all the other member states in the EU, it's much better, but it is unbelievable at what stage of digitalization Germany is operating, right? And this is something which has to be overcome. And I think what we decided in the council or in the board is to build up a kind of an epistemic infrastructure, building up data together with the European Environmental Agency, so to say, to do a much better evaluation of this kind of policies. I think that's something which is not just to giving advice, it's just to build up an infrastructure where basically we can build a stock and capitalize also for the future, that basically policymakers cannot navigate in such a crisis without having the relevant data available. And this is a task of the scientists, also of scientists.
Very, very much so. And one example of many that we heard about ways in which, sort of having dedicated scientific councils can add a new and important dimension to policymaking. I want to say I wasn't able to distinguish in the questions that came in specifically who might have asked one from the room. So I did go ahead and try to insert bits and pieces and lines of questioning into the conversation. I hope that those who put inputs in did recognize that. We don't have the opportunity to go take on all of the specifics. Some, if you will, sort of Mary, I might still also pass on to you where there are colleagues that wanted to know more about the specifics of the Irish situation. But what I want to basically take as a last topic for our panel here is one specific question is asking about the situation in member states that don't have a national advisory body. So and make this also connect the two of you in a way, you know, if with the head of the EU level board and with the head of a national advisory body. Can tell us a little bit about the way that you see the relationship and potential collaboration. I know that you have started engaging in dialogue between the EU level and the national level among advisory bodies, and what do you think can be done to support the establishment of similar councils elsewhere? You know, this could be a legal requirement in the governance regulation or in the EU climate law, etc. And here I'm really openly asking, so who wants to go first to talk about the relationship in other councils? And the Oscar goes to Ottmar.
Oh, okay. I thought Mary should start. Yeah, so what can be done? So I think, first of all, it is very important also for the European Scientific Advisory Board that we can build on the national scientific advisory boards, because it's for us a source of information, gathering information, but also it could help us to disseminate some of our messages, right? That it seems to me that this is very important, and we had already a meeting with the national boards, and this was very productive and very helpful. The second thing is it's more a capacity building issue, that countries who have not such a board, I think this is extremely valuable to do this. I don't want to propose a specific ways to establish this, but I think policymakers in Europe and should think about and encourage countries to set up such a board in one way or another. But it is important that this board is independent. It should be not within the government, fully independent. It should be clear that the appointment is based on either the scientific expertise or a specific role in the public. That would be helpful, and also give this independent board let's say the opportunity to pick up, not just to fulfill a mandate, but to pick up the important questions. And I know some governments are concerned, but from my point of view, they shouldn't be too much concerned, because one thing is very important. The current governments within the EU are confronted with multiple crises. And what you have to do is, in a multiple crisis, as a necessary condition, you have to close the feedback loops, and you have to speed up the social learning process. And you cannot learn if you are not open about your success and about your failures. And in that sense, it might be sometimes annoying to have the strange scientists telling governments what failed and what was the success. But in the end, it's part of a learning process. And I think in the end, they will benefit.
Thank you. The pain of having to be accountable. Mary, with Ottmar having had to go first because I asked him to, you now get the chance to also speak to that, but also, basically, I think voice your expectations for how your colleagues in the new EU level advisory board might support or work with you.
Well, having spent so many years working in the European Commission, I have had the benefit of seeing the utility and the value of member states working together, exchanging their experiences, for better or for worse, as the case may be, challenging each other and helping each other. So I am 100% in favor of having a mechanism that will bring, the member states together. We are in a very unique position. We are 27 countries with effectively the same legislative framework surrounding our activities. There are colleagues in other parts of the world who are, active in an international climate council network, but there the legislation is different. The objective may be the same, but the legislation is different. In Europe, we have the same general framework. We're operating in the same way. We have different starting points, and we'll have potentially different paths to get to the solutions, but we can learn so much from each other. Repeatedly, in our discussions back in Ireland, we say, what have they done in Sweden? What are they doing in France? how has Portugal looked at this issue? What's the innovation coming out of Germany? It's so useful to broaden the debate beyond your own country into the other member states and to benefit from their knowledge and experience. So I am 100, if I could be, 110% in favor of having a mechanism, firstly, for having counterparts in all the member states, and then ensuring that we are able to have this dialogue, have this exchange. And I think having Otmar in his scientific board, it's, shall we say, the pivot around which we can operate. So I see the structures as they will, I hope, evolve over time, strengthening the dialogue, strengthening the whole process, and giving great rewards to all of us who will be participating in it. So I'm quite optimistic as to how the issue can develop over time.
Thank you very much indeed, Mary. That was a very positive and cooperative note to end on. A big thank you and a round of applause to our two panelists, please. And by means of closing, Erica, if you will, so join me on the panel again. Thank you so much. I want to make sure to actually point you to some of the outputs of such collaborative spirit across the EU that we were also able to experience even under the tricky circumstances of the pandemic with our colleagues in Climate Recon 2050. They have all done also pieces of analysis that actually do this type of comparative assessment. There are therefore a number of publications already on our website. Others are forthcoming that are looking at the content of long-term strategies across the ones that were available on issues such as the role of natural gas, the treatment of individual transport, the role of district heating. And they have also analyzed side by side in a regional fashion the long-term strategies by several member states. We have a publication by our colleagues from Visa Europa on the Visegrad 4 countries and how their strategies compare. So please check those out. We have display copies and download codes here for people that are in the room. With that, we have a short public service announcement, if you will, from Erica, and after that I will close it off. Erica, please.
Thank you, Matthias. And yes, I wanted to just take the opportunity to mention something that will be launched later this year. I think Vicky and others have mentioned that this is a very busy year in terms of all of the different processes and actions that are happening towards climate neutrality. And those include the progress monitoring and policy consistency checks under the EU climate law of how the EU is doing on its path to climate neutrality. Later this year, a new body is going to be launched called the European Climate Neutrality Observatory, ECNO. You heard it here first. And the idea is that ECNO will be a neutral, sort of independent observatory of how on track we are to net zero, with a particular focus on the structural changes within all of the sectors of the economy, between and within sectors, including the enablers that will need to be in place for changes that need to happen further down the line. So really digging below the emissions curve to see actually what is happening across the economy. And this ECNO will be issuing a flagship report each year of how progress is going, and also some products to monitor different official EU processes. And so the idea is that it will help to be a sort of shadow and accountability mechanism to the institutions, perhaps even an inspiration to them, and also hopefully a very useful, easily accessible service to stakeholders to be able to access this kind of independent view of how things are going. So we hope this will be another useful sort of input from the scientific side.
All right, thank you very much indeed, Erica. Looking forward to seeing those outputs, and for full transparency, also sort of being involved with other partners and making this happen, and hopefully providing additional input to the institutions and in fact the advisory bodies as an additional source of information for their outputs. With that, I want to thank our speakers again, both here and in France and in Ireland. I want to thank the many colleagues that made this event happen, both here in the room and also back in Berlin. And I want to invite those that are here to stay on and join us, in the real world for some more interaction than we were able to have right now as part of this discussion. That was very much panel centered. So we're going to go and become much more decentralized in the next hour. Thank you, everyone, for your attention and for your time. And we look forward to continuing this dialogue. Thank you.